Thus far, we're going to take up on page 18 of the material with starting chapter 5. My plans are we'll have a couple of class periods on this, and then chapter 6, to get us back on schedule, I plan to cover chapter 6 in one class period. It's a short chapter, but not that there's not anything less important in it, but just for that. And then if everything goes as planned, the rest of the chapters 7 through 12, we will have 2 class periods for each of those. That's basically the schedule that I've got. So on page 18 of the material, we're going to start here in just a moment. Does anyone, I apologize for not thinking to ask this, there are extra copies of the material out on the table in the foyer if you've left yours at home or if you need one. So does anyone by chance? Okay. Brian, would you get Judy? Thank you. And I apologize for not asking this, but on page 18, at the top of page 18 is where we're, and you're welcome to that if you want to keep it. But before we begin, let's bow. I've asked Hank to lead us in an opening prayer on behalf of our study that might be profitable as well as for all classes, and then we'll get started. Let us bow.
Bow with me, please. Heavenly Father, we come before you, thankful for this midweek Bible study. We ask that you be with us. Be with Roger as he delivers your word to us. Father, just help us all and be with us in all things. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen. Thank you. Okay, to summarize the first 4 chapters, or to recap, what are some lessons that we should take if we were to just summarize those first 4 chapters? Here is the one thing that I think is first and foremost. I hope that you have learned the reason why vanity exists. It's because simply man has become disobedient to God's will. You find there in these 3 verses, I want us to just mention Romans 8, verses 20 and 21. There you recall when we were studying this earlier, the Apostle Paul made mention that the creation was subjected to vanity in hopes that it might be set free from its slavery. And that, of course, is having reference to slavery from sin. God purposefully dealt with man when he disobeyed him. God said, this is how it's going to be until you go back to obeying me. This is the world you're going to live in. It's kind of like when Moses told the children of Israel, when they asked for a king, Moses had told them years earlier, the day will come when you will do that. And when you do, here's what your life is going to be like. And it'll get so bad that you will regret the day you asked or demanded that. And this is kind of what God has told us in His Word. Everything was fine as long as you listened to me. When you ventured out on your own, this is what entered your world. And we also see that, we've already studied that back in chapter 3 of Ecclesiastes, verse 14, when we read there that God has so worked things in such a way, these appointed times, that man might fear Him. That's what God wants out of us. The futility that we're subjected to, even we as God's people, we know why it's happened. But often it's very trying on us. So these verses, it talks about how the ground was cursed and so forth. But just the bottom line, short and sweet, the reason that vanity is in our midst, because we've all sinned and fell short of the glory of God. And we cannot pass this buck, so to speak. All of us have committed sin. We are part of the problem. Thankfully, we've overcome that. But this should help us when we get here in a few moments to talk about there is comfort. We know that. There is comfort, and that comfort comes when we turn and obey God. So what the author has basically talked about in these first 4 chapters, there is no meaning to life as long as you live in rebellion to God. Okay? In this chapter, the focus, or at least in the first 7 verses, is upon worship. Worship can be just like life. It can be futile. Or a synonym, worship can be in vain, can it? Life can be in vain. Living can be in vain. And the author here in chapter 5 is talking about worship. It can become vanity. And of course, the reason is just like life. When we disobey in worship, our worship is just vanity. It's futile. It's unacceptable. And this is why he opens up in chapter 5, as we're going to see, that when you enter the house of God, what do you need to take heed and do? Take heed to your ways. Okay? So that's just a brief recap. So, verse 1. He says, guard your steps as you go to the house of God and approach to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they're doing evil. Take note of a sacrifice of fools doing evil. There's a connection there. It's essentially saying, isn't it one and the same? We have some verses that I gave you to read ahead of time. All of those verses mention the sacrifice of the wicked. These verses here, Proverbs 15:21 and Psalms. All of these verses talk about or mention the sacrifice of the wicked. Is a wicked person and the fool that's mentioned here one and the same? Is it talking about the same person? As you read these verses before you came to class, the sacrifice of a wicked, is that what a fool does? Look again at verse 1. Approach God to listen rather than to do what? What does the fool not recognize that he's doing? And so these verses talk about the sacrifice of the wicked. Is that not the fool? Sure it is. Sure it is. And we have Isaiah. You think about the sacrifice. What makes a sacrifice unacceptable? Think of Cain and Abel. Why was Cain's sacrifice not accepted? Disobedience. This is a simple message of Ecclesiastes. Your life will be vanity when you live a life in disobedience to God's will. This is why the end of the book says to do what? Fear God and obey God. Keep God's commandments. The fool offers a wicked sacrifice when he offers, as Cain did, something that God said this is that he didn't specify. A fool's sacrifice is such because he doesn't listen to God. You see that verse 1. Now I want to point this out to show a connection between a life. We have worship here in this chapter, but in the first 4 chapters we were talking about life that people lived outside of worship. Okay? Does the life that I live outside of worship when I'm assembled, does the life that I live affect my worship when I do come into the house of God? So, when it comes to a sacrifice, I can offer or do the right things. I can sing a cappella. I can observe the memorial. every first day of the week. I can give as prospered and it not be accepted, or it can be hindered or rejected if my life Monday through Saturday is not Christian. You see that? Even though I'm doing the right thing in worship, God will not accept it. Now, why do I say that? Because of these verses here that we're going to look at. First of all, in let me find my page here. I've got my pages out of sync. Isaiah chapter 1. Isaiah chapter 1. Here's my problem. Isaiah chapter 1. I had verse 11 for you to read. Now, verse 11 mentions a sacrifice that's unacceptable. You see that? It says, "What are your sacrifices? I've had enough of them. I take no pleasure in them." But as we read beginning at verse 12, the latter part of verse 15. Drop down to the latter part of verse 15 and let's read the remainder of that chapter. Your hands are covered with blood. You see that? I don't know what version you might be using, but the last sentence in verse 15. The reason that God, in verse 11, says, I don't, your sacrifices just make me sick to my stomach. Because he says in verse 15, your hands are covered with blood. How so? Look at verses 16 and 17. You need to wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove the evil of your deeds from my sight, cease doing evil. Learn to do good, seek justice, reprove the ruthless, defend the orphan, and plead for the widow. Now you recall in chapter 4 it was talking about how justice was perverted for those who were defenseless. This is exactly what Isaiah is saying that the people of his day were doing. They were dishonest in their daily living. Those that they could cheat and swindle, they did. But yet they would, as the world words it today, but they would go to church and act like they were just the most godly, pious, but their dealings through the week was anything but godly. And so God said, I'm sick of your sacrifices. Don't give me the sacrifice of a wicked person. In Jeremiah chapter 6 and verse 20. Okay, Jeremiah chapter 6 and verse 20, he mentioned again, what purpose does frankincense come to me from Sheba and the sweet cane from a distant land? Your burnt offerings are not acceptable, and your sacrifices are not pleasing to me. Why so? Turn back to Jeremiah chapter 5. Let's read beginning at verse 21. And you'll see why God said through Jeremiah, your sacrifices are not acceptable. Verse 21 of Jeremiah 5. Hear this, O foolish and senseless people, who have eyes but see not, who have ears but hear not. Do you not fear me, declares the Lord? Do you not tremble in my presence? For I have placed the sand as a boundary for the sea, an eternal decree, so it cannot cross over it. Though the waves toss, yet they cannot prevail. Though they roar, yet they cannot cross over it. But this people has a stubborn and rebellious heart. They've turned aside and departed. They do not say in their heart, let us now fear the Lord our God, who gives rain in its season, both autumn rain and spring rain, and who keeps for us the appointed weeks of harvest. Your iniquities have turned these away, and your sins have withheld good from you. For wicked men are found among my people. They watch like fowlers, lying in wait. They set a trap, and they catch men like a cage full of birds. So their houses are full of deceit, and therefore they have become great and rich. They are fat, they are sleek, and they also excel in deeds of wickedness. They do not plead the cause of the orphans, that they may prosper. They do not defend the rights of the poor. Shall I not punish these people, declares the Lord? On a nation such as this, shall I not avenge myself? An appalling and horrible thing has happened in the land. The prophets prophesy falsely, the priests rule on their own authority, and my people love it so. But what will you do at the end? This is why in chapter 6 and verse 20, God said, your burnt offerings are not acceptable, and your sacrifices are not pleasing. So I ask again, does our life outside of worship affect our worship, even if we're doing the right thing? And this is why in chapter 4 we read about such injustice being done. And people desiring, I would rather, or while the author said, for people who are like that, it would be better that they had never known life. Better that they'd never even been born. This is why he said that. And so this is what chapter 5 is dealing with. Sacrifice can be the right thing, but because of the life lived outside of worship, envy, competition, perversion of justice, it's not accepted by God. And so, all these things affect our worship. You notice now also, I have in verse 2 and 3 and 4 next, I have 3 words that I've underlined and put in a different color. They are key words, okay? First of all, let's read these. Do not be quick with your do not be quick with your mouth or impulsive in thought to bring up a matter in the presence of God. For God is in heaven and you are on the earth. Therefore let your words be few. For the dream comes through much effort, and the voice of a fool through many words. When you make a vow to God, do not be late in paying it, for he takes no delight in fools. Pay what you vow. First of all, quick that you see there in verse 2, that means hasty or rash. In other words, he's saying, don't be hasty or rash with your mouth in the presence of God. As we go on, he says, God is in heaven, you are on earth, therefore let your words be few. Then he says in verse 3, for the dream comes through much effort, and in a similar statement, the voice of a fool comes through many words. What does this mean? This is having reference to this effort of the amount of toil and time and energy that a wicked person puts into doing everything but what God says. You ever heard it said of people in regard to their secular work? Some people will work harder trying to get out of work. You ever heard something like that? Some people will just labor and labor just to not do what their boss has assigned for them to do. This is what the wicked do. If we would just do God's will, we would not be as busy and as frustrated, but we spend more time trying to devise a scheme to get out of that. We have in Proverbs chapter 4 a passage that I want us to look at that I think probably one of the best that talks about this. In Proverbs chapter 4, on this much effort, of the wicked? In Proverbs chapter 4, beginning at verse 14, let's read 3 verses here. This is the counsel or advice that a father is giving to his son in regard to the wicked. To his son he says, "Son, do not enter the path of the wicked, and don't proceed in the way of evil men. Avoid it. Do not pass by it. Turn away from it and pass on." Why, Father? Look at verse 16. This is what the wicked do. They cannot sleep unless they do evil. They are robbed of sleep unless they make someone stumble. This is what he's talking about. Dreaming, scheming, planning. There's a lot of effort that wicked people put into to accomplish their wickedness. It doesn't just happen. People, I know there is such a thing as sins of ignorance, but people don't sin ignorantly. They know what they're doing. This concept of sinning in ignorance simply means they're ignorant of God's will. It doesn't mean they don't know what they're doing, because there's so many passages in the Bible that talk about the scheming and the planning. They'll lie and turn in their bed, figuring out a way to defraud, and just because they're just obsessed with getting. Another passage in Proverbs, look at chapter 36 of Proverbs. No, that's not. Maybe it's 26. No, I've got the wrong passage here. My apologies. Let's go to Micah. Let me see if I can find it here just a minute. Proverbs. I apologize for this chapter. Psalms, my bad. Psalms 36. Psalms, the 36th Psalm. It talks about the great effort of the wicked. The first 4 verses. Transgression speaks to the ungodly within his heart. There is no fear of God before his eyes, for it flatters him in his own eyes, concerning the discovery of his iniquity and the hatred of it. The words of his mouth are wickedness and deceit. He has ceased to be wise and do good. Notice verse 4, he plans wickedness where? On his bed. He sets himself on a path that is not good. He does not despise evil. This is the dream. This is not as we would think of in the normal sense. Do you ever dream at night? This is talking about scheming and planning evil. And the author of Ecclesiastes says, this comes with much effort. And this relates to when you're doing that. You know, does a wicked person keep his doings to himself? What do you generally associate with a fool? What does a fool do? What's he known for? And so the latter part of this, how can you recognize a fool? What's the chief characteristic of one? And when we're talking about a fool, we're talking about one who is void of understanding in regard to God's will. That's a fool. Doesn't mean he may not know how to fly a rocket to the moon. Talking about he's ignorant in regard to God's plan of salvation. Okay? Let's notice also one last passage in Micah chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Woe to those who scheme iniquity, Micah wrote. Woe to those who work out evil on their beds, When morning comes, they do it, for it is in the power of their hands. They covet fields and they seize them, houses and take them away. They rob a man and his house, a man and his inheritance. This is what he's talking about with these dreams. People who do what we studied in chapter 4, work injustice, to take what is someone else's dishonestly. He talked about in chapter 4, that's vanity. That's why in the place of justice, there's injustice. And people despair of living. They would choose death over that. Example that we're talking, this is talking about the efforts to cover up wickedness. Now, quickly, in regard to the voice of a fool through many words, jot these passages down and let's turn and read them. Back in Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 19. In Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 19. When there are many words, transgression is unavoidable, but he who restrains his lips is wise. You catch that? In chapter 17 of Proverbs, verses 27 and 28, again, here's wisdom. He who restrains his words has knowledge, and he who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding. Even a fool, when he keeps silent, is considered what? Wise. When he closes his lips, he is counted prudent. But people who just talk and talk and talk and talk, eventually they're going to contradict and cross. A person who's wanting to flaunt his own knowledge and flaunt his own wisdom, what's he going to do? Is he going to say it in 5 words and hush? So all of this, he says, don't be that way in the presence of God. And in verse 1, when you enter the house of God, you guard your ways and you guard your lips. I thought of David, King David in 2 Samuel chapter 11, as far as this concept of the great effort and the planning and the scheming. You know, David committed adultery, didn't he, with Bathsheba? Look at all the scheming that went on in 2 Samuel chapter 11 to cover that up, to hide his wickedness. He tried first to get Uriah drunk, didn't he? That failed. Then he schemed and planned and worked on his bed, so to speak, to get him killed. And in order to get that done, many other people were involved and they met their death. And their survivors were innocent people who suffered along with the people who were killed just to make sure Uriah got killed in that battle. Was this not an example of injustice in the place where there should have been justice? We have that with David. And it's interesting, if you want to turn back to 2 Samuel chapter 12, this is one of those passages that I encourage you to highlight, mark, remember, or note in whatever way, because it applies in every period of Bible history, and it's certainly applicable today. Nathan told David in 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verse 12, what you did, David, you did it secretly, which corresponds to this planning and scheming. David worked and worked and worked. If he'd have been busy doing his responsibilities as a king, this would have never happened. He was like Saul. Saul, when he was hunting David and pursuing David, he was not fulfilling his duties as a king. He was obsessed with killing David. He wasn't doing his duties as a king, and his kingdom crumbled. And when we're busy in our life, living in such a way different to what God said we're to live as a Christian, our life is going to fall apart. We're going to have misery. We're going to have problems. It may be marital problems. It may be whatever. This is what God says because of vanity. Do we think our worship, if we're living that way, that when we come here, God's going to just be pleased and smile over what we're doing? While you're in 2 Samuel, here's a more important verse. Drop down to verse 14. David was shown by Nathan's words, this is the real damage, David. Because what you did in secret, he said in verse 14 of 2 Samuel 12, because by this deed you have given occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme. And that's what our deeds do when we sin. This is a hypocrite. This is the effects of a hypocrite. Again, we're all very thankful that we have learned. That's what I was. That's not how I'm trying to live now. We got much to be thankful for, don't we? But we can look and see others suffering through what we used to do. If that don't motivate us to be evangelistic and to try to teach them out of this pit of misery, I don't think anything will. It's kind of like what the Apostle Paul said in Romans 2 in verse 24. He said the same thing. This passage in 2 Samuel 12 verse 14 is saying the same thing that Paul said in Romans chapter 2 and verse 4. Romans 2 verse 24. Romans 2 and verse 24. What did Paul say there? He was talking to the Jews. He said, because of the way you've lived, what are the Gentiles doing? This is what an inconsistent life by someone who says, I'm a Christian, I love God. When we live wickedly, this is what happens to the name of God. The same thing was said, if you want to jot the verse down, we'll not read it, in Isaiah 52 and verse 5. The same thing. And so, before we move on, we have to deal with this. When we come to the house of God, how important is it? Misuse of our thoughts and speech, how important is that? Why is there wisdom in few words? This is why Peter said, if any man speak, how is he to speak? Or with what is he to speak? 1 Peter 4:11. Jesus, or it was taught by Luke in Luke chapter 14, verse 33, whoever does not forsake all, you can't be my disciple. But how many of us, this is something to do some personal soul searching, how many of us have at times did exactly what Ananias and Sapphira did in Acts 5? We've brought apart and we've talked like this is all. I've give it all. I've give a lot more than in reality I have. How many of us have failed saying, this is all I can do for the Lord. This is all I have. This is all I can do. This is all I have. Let's not be like Ananias. Let's guard our mouth in the presence of the Lord. And this leads us into the next part, vows. What are we talking about here with vows? Okay? When you make a vow, don't be late in paying it. God takes no delight in that. Is it better, since if you're going to make a vow, let me go back to this screen here. When you make a vow to God, if you're going to be late in paying it, He says it's better to not, in verse 5, it's better that you don't vow than to vow and not pay. Let me ask you a question. If you know you're not going to go through with your vow, are you better off to not vow to God? This gets back to Sunday's class. If I know I'm not going to live out faithful, I'm not going to fulfill, would I be better off to not obey the gospel? If I know I'm not going to live and serve God faithfully, would I be better off to just not obey the gospel? This is kind of like Revelations 3. Okay? Revelations 3:15. I would thou wert cold or hot, so because you're neither I will spew. Is it better to be cold or hot? Or is it better to be lukewarm? Does God want us to serve Him? To be hot, on fire, avid, zealous? Is it better to be cold if I can't do that? You see what I'm getting at? This is kind of like, would I be better off to have never been born than to be born and see what all's going on? Would it have been better to not have life? What did we answer to that last Sunday? Rather than meet the shame of disobedience, would it have been better if God had just not allowed me to be born? To me not have known God. Would that be better? Wendell answered that very good. It is not better to not have life. What's better than knowing God and knowing what God's done? You know, I asked at early classes, why did God make humans? Do you recall the answer? Why did God make us? What if He hadn't made us? Would His works have been known? Could the animals do evangelism? He didn't make them capable of it. Why did God make us in His image? He had a reason for making us and making us unique. It was to make known His will, His doings, that He might be known. And that was His choice. He chose to do that. He had things in His mind, speaking from a human standpoint. God had things in His mind that He was going to do. He had it mapped out and planned out from the foundation of the world. He knew, Jesus was purposed from the foundation of the world. There was a reason. God knew how things were going to be. How do vows relate to discipleship? We're talking about a vow. What are we talking about? Let's get that out of the way first. What's the author here in Ecclesiastes 5 talking about when he's talking about when you make a vow to God, don't be late in paying it? Any thoughts? Now, do we make any oaths to God? What about when we obey the gospel? Is there any connection with some type of an oath or a vow that we're making? Why is there a step in the 5-step plan of salvation of confession? What do we confess? And why do that if I have no intention of living Remember, Jesus said in Luke 6:46, why do you call me Lord if you're not going to? So when we say in the good confession, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, He's given all authority, He will be Lord of my life. This is the same thing the children of Israel were called upon to do in Exodus 19, or Exodus 20, or Exodus 19, I believe it is. When Moses assembled them, and they spent 3 days getting prepared just to hear God talk. You think about that. 3 days getting ready for church, purifying themselves. And Moses spoke to them all that God said speak at that time, and they said, here's our commitment. All that the Lord has said, we will do. That's a vow. That's a vow. We're told in Luke chapter 9 and verse 62, any man that puts his hand to the plow and does what? He's not fit. Don't vow to God. Matthew 25 and verse 24, what was said of the 1 talent man? What did he do with his 1 talent? Don't go back on your vows. Don't go back on your responsibilities. So, will not vowing benefit? We have to understand, what do we do by way of making vows today to God? Do sinners make vows to God? Of course not. Who makes vows to God? Those who come into the house of God. Those who are serving God. This is talking about religious people. Is that us? If I'm not going to pay my vow, would it be better off? Is there a benefit to just not bother vowing? No. No, I'm to make a commitment to God. This year's theme that Kyle has been preaching on monthly is about covenant relationships. A covenant is an agreement that 2 parties enter in. One part says, I will do my part. The other part says, I will do my part. That's a vow. A covenant is a binding agreement. We enter into a covenant relationship with God through obedience to the gospel. That's a vow. It's just like a marriage. In a marriage, what does the 2 people exchange? And when we obey the gospel, we are making a vow. You will be Lord, I will be the servant. Don't make your vow and not pay. It's better that you. So when he says this, it's being like Revelation 3:15. Okay? When he says, I hate that you're lukewarm. I would prefer you being cold or hot. It's not meaning that God says, I would really like some of you to be cold. But in essence, if you're not going to serve God, are you not going to be a hindrance to those that are trying? We talk about that sometimes and use language. If you're going to be worthless, don't let the door hit you on the way out. We are here to serve God and to edify and build up and strengthen. If we're not going to do that, we're going to be a discouragement to those outside of Christ to come follow. They're going to blaspheme the name of God. And for our brothers who are trying, we're going to be a discouragement and cause faintness of heart in them. So this is what I've come up with so far on these first 7 verses. Now let's quickly go on because I want to try to finish this. Again, verses 6 and 7. Don't let your speech cause you to sin. Don't say in the presence of the messenger of God, it was a mistake. Why should God be angry on account of your voice and destroy the works of your hand? Again, for in many dreams and in many words there's futility. Rather fear God. Don't try to cover up. Well, all this is talking about, since we're out of time and I want to finish these verses. When you sin and your sin's pointed out, own up to it. Keep it short and sweet. Don't try to, with many words and excuses, don't do that. And summing this up, from the first 4 chapters, discipleship along with worship, it's a very serious matter. Our tongue or our words, no matter what we say, it will not undo what an unrepentant life continues to do. And our life outside of worship, I hope you get that from tonight's class. Our life outside of worship affects our worship. When we draw near to hear God, that means to obey God, we're acting by His authority, okay? So I hope tonight's class was beneficial. Appreciate your attention and your attention. Mark chapter 5, verse 10. Chapter 5, verse 10, and Lord's willing, we'll take up with this Sunday.